We know Vikings as fierce warriors and ruthless raiders, but there's a darker story that history barely whispers about. When the axes fell silent and the shield walls broke apart, the real horror began. The dead men were fortunate. Their suffering had ended. But the women who survived, the wives, daughters, and mothers, faced something far worse than death itself. The cruelty they endured made a warrior's death seem like mercy. If you're interested in documented history from the Viking and Norse period, make sure to subscribe to Echoes of History. It helps us continue bringing you these untold stories. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. The historical record exists, though chronicles often fall silent where the worst begins. From Ibn Fadlan's eyewitness accounts to archaeological discoveries in Dublin's ancient markets, the evidence tells a story that the Sagas deliberately avoided. At Clonmacnoise Monastery, Thorgils and his fleet killed 43 monks defending their altar. The chronicler carefully described each fallen warrior, then stopped writing about what happened to the women. But the physical evidence survived where words failed. Dublin's Woodquay excavations revealed the skeleton of a thriving slave market. Iron shackles designed specifically for women's wrists, ankle rings small enough for children, warehouse foundations built to store human cargo. The Norsemen didn't just steal gold and silver from Ireland, they stole people. A captured wife became merchandise, stripped of her humanity and reduced to a price tag. The market rates were calculated with cold precision and recorded in runic stone inscriptions at Schleswig. 20 silver pieces for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 for one injured during capture. These weren't random numbers, they were standardized prices carved into permanent records, business receipts in stone. And for many women, being sold quickly was actually the best outcome they could hope for. What awaited those who weren't immediately sold was unimaginably worse. In 862, Vikings attacked the settlement at Portmarnock. Irish annals recorded 47 warriors killed in battle, but wrote nothing about the 53 women seized from the longhouses. The official history simply stopped. But nearby bogs later revealed what the chroniclers wouldn't write. 23 female bodies, all bearing marks of deliberate violence. These weren't chaotic battle deaths. The injury patterns told a clear story. Skulls fractured from behind, forearms shattered while trying to defend themselves, ribs broken by sustained assault. These were executions performed days after the fighting ended, after captors had made calculated decisions about which women to keep and which to eliminate. The wounds showed planning, not rage. This pattern repeated across Viking territories. When the Great Heathen Army captured Reading in 871, chroniclers documented King Ethelred's military defeat, but completely omitted what happened to the royal household's women. Later excavations at the Old Saxon Palace found stones heavily stained with iron oxide, blood residue from dozens of deaths. The stones remembered what the chronicles refused to record. Norse war culture operated under strict laws regarding conquered women. When a warrior killed an enemy in battle, his victim's wife legally became his property. Not as a servant, as a forced wife. The Old Norse term was kona, meaning owned woman, property that breathed and suffered. Icelandic law codes detailed the exact ritual. The captor had to declare ownership before witnesses. The woman had no voice in the matter, no choice, no escape route. The forced marriage was completely legal, and any children born were considered legitimate heirs. The assault wasn't just tolerated by Viking society, it was literally written into their legal framework. The Sagas law codes specified that ownership claims had to be made within 3 days of capture, or rival warriors could contest the claim. Women were fought over exactly like livestock, bought and sold and traded without any consideration of their humanity or wishes. Forced marriage wasn't even the worst fate awaiting captured women. In 878, Norse raiders completely destroyed the monastery at Bangor. The annals recorded its total annihilation, but said nothing about what followed the conquest. Burn layers at similar raid sites tell the truth that chronicles avoided. Bone fragments from women arranged in deliberate ceremonial patterns. Norse religious practices demanded human sacrifice, and captured women filled that requirement. When a prominent warrior died, everything he owned accompanied him to the afterlife: his horses, his weapons, and his women. Ibn Fadlan witnessed such a ceremony on the Volga River in 921, describing in disturbing detail the ritual rape and killing of a slave girl at her master's funeral. Archaeological evidence proves this wasn't an isolated incident that shocked witnesses. It was standard practice across Viking territories. Boat burials throughout Scandinavia contain female skeletons showing strangulation marks and drug traces in their teeth. Chemical analysis indicates they were subdued with henbane before death. They walked to the funeral pyre dazed and hallucinating, made compliant through forced drugging. Perhaps the drugs dulled their terror in those final moments, or perhaps being aware but unable to resist made it even worse. By 907, the Great Army established winter quarters at Thetford. Chronicles mentioned stolen cattle and burned churches, but nothing about daily life inside the camp. The refuse heaps spoke instead. Dozens of infant bones, all bearing blunt force trauma. These weren't stillbirths or natural deaths, they were murders. Viking law stated clearly that if the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved. If an infant couldn't work, the infant was killed. Pure, brutal economics. The Domesday Book later recorded this practice continuing under Norman rule. Population studies of Yorkshire show demographic gaps precisely when Norse settlements had been established. The bones at Repton confirmed the pattern. The Great Army's 873 to 874 winter camp contained 249 skeletons. Only 63 were women. Women don't vanish naturally. They were carried away. Viking Dublin wasn't simply a port for fishing or legitimate trade. It was the beating heart of a vast human trafficking network. Weekly ships arrived carrying fresh captives. Women were sorted by age like livestock. The young ones went to Norse farms as breeding stock. Older women were shipped east into Islamic slave markets along the Russian river routes. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings in Dublin's waterfront posts, reveals continuous rebuilding from 841 to 970. More than 60 years of steady, deliberate expansion. That growth wasn't driven by fishing or fur trading. It was powered by something much darker. The slave markets were thriving, and they needed more space with each passing year. Each new dock meant more room for slave ships, more warehouse space for human cargo. The warehouses themselves tell a chilling story. Foundations built from stone, designed to hold up to 200 captives simultaneously. Drainage channels carved into the floors, not for rainwater, but for human waste. These weren't temporary holding pens. They were long-term storage facilities, human stockrooms. Arabic chroniclers from the 9th century described Viking slave caravans that reached as far as Baghdad. Fair-skinned women from Celtic and Germanic lands fetched premium prices in Eastern markets. They were displayed as exotic luxuries, rare goods for the wealthy. The Vikings understood their buyers perfectly and supplied the trade with ruthless efficiency. The main eastern slave route stretched through Novgorod and Kiev, covering more than 1,000 miles along the Dnieper River. Rune-carved ship manifests listed slaves alongside amber and furs as cargo. The standard load was about 20 women per ship. These weren't occasional crimes of opportunity. This was organized, systematic, industrial-scale human trafficking. If you value this kind of documented history, please subscribe to Echoes of History to help us continue this work. Captivity wasn't the worst fate. Being sold wasn't the worst fate. Forced marriage and even ritual sacrifice weren't the worst fates a woman could face. The most terrifying outcome awaited those who dared to resist their captors. In 914, Irish forces successfully retook Dublin from Norse control. The annals of the Four Masters described the glorious victory, the city freed, the Vikings driven out in defeat. But the records said absolutely nothing about what was discovered outside the city walls. Later archaeology filled that deliberate silence with horrifying clarity. Excavations revealed punishment pits, stone-lined holes designed for slow, agonizing death. Inside were skeletons bearing distinctive injuries, legs deliberately broken so escape was impossible, arms shattered to prevent suicide attempts. These women weren't killed quickly as punishment. They were kept alive specifically to suffer as long as possible. Each pit measured 6 feet deep and 3 feet across. Too small to lie down flat, too shallow to stand upright. Victims died crouched in agony as death crept slowly over days or sometimes weeks. Viking law codes explicitly confirmed this punishment. Any enslaved woman who harmed or killed her master was to be buried alive. But it was never a swift burial. The pits were shallow enough to allow air to reach the victim, but too deep to climb out. Death came from thirst, cold exposure, or simple exhaustion. Soil analysis from Dublin's execution grounds supports this timeline. Decomposition layers indicate prolonged dying, not immediate death after burial. Some pits contained sharp stones specifically placed to tear flesh. Others had standing water at the bottom to slowly drown victims. The goal wasn't simply execution, it was prolonged agony as a lesson to others. Captive women were forced to watch these deaths, learning exactly what defiance would bring. By 937, the last major Viking raid on Ireland ended at the Battle of Brunanburh. 5 kingdoms united to defeat the Norse invasion decisively. The military victory was complete. But what they discovered in the enemy baggage train was even more revealing. Portable breeding pens. These weren't crude, improvised cages. They were carefully engineered frameworks with iron fittings and modular wooden structures. The pens were built specifically to restrain humans during long marches or extended transport. Chains sized for children. Sections that could be assembled into large compounds or quickly disassembled for rapid movement. They were mobile slave markets that traveled with the army itself. Each pen could hold a dozen adults or 20 children. Iron rings fixed into the wood anchored chains securely in place. Wear patterns showed constant use. This wasn't occasional wartime brutality. This was an organized system built directly into the logistics of Viking military campaigns. For the Vikings, warfare wasn't only about conquest or plunder, it was fundamentally about harvesting people. The wives and daughters of defeated warriors weren't simply collateral damage or unfortunate casualties. They were the primary target. Living resources to be seized, processed, distributed, and exploited. Archaeological surveys of Viking towns confirm this systematically. Every major settlement had holding pens built into its infrastructure. Every harbor had processing sites for newly captured slaves. The infrastructure was everywhere, woven seamlessly into daily Viking life, hidden in plain sight because it was so normalized that nobody questioned it. In 954, Eric Bloodaxe fell at Stainmore. With his death, the last independent Viking kingdom in England finally collapsed. But the extensive networks of slavery didn't vanish with Viking political power. They were simply absorbed into new systems. Christian rulers inherited the entire infrastructure and merely renamed it. Monastery records describe a massive sudden rise in indentured servants immediately after Viking defeats. These weren't voluntary labor contracts. They were the same women, the same captives, operating under a different legal label for Christian markets. In 1066, Harold Hardrada died at Stamford Bridge, marking the traditional end of the Viking Age in England. Yet archaeology reveals what the chronicles deliberately omitted. Mass graves of women dated precisely to the years of Viking defeats. These women weren't killed during raids. They were executed afterward. Evidence systematically erased. The reason becomes clear at Repton. A mass grave sealed in 986 was recently uncovered containing 236 bodies, all female. Each bore signs of deliberate killing, blunt force trauma, strangulation marks, evidence of poisoning. But isotope testing revealed the shocking truth. These weren't captive enemies. They were Norse-born women. The grave dates to the exact moment when Viking power in England was collapsing, when Norse towns were falling one by one. The women buried there weren't enemy prisoners. They were the Vikings' own wives and daughters. Why would they do this? Because the men knew. They knew exactly what awaited captured women because they had inflicted it themselves for generations. Faced with inevitable defeat, they turned those same brutal methods inward. They killed their own families before enemies could take them. Fathers ended their daughters' lives. Husbands executed their wives. Soil analysis shows the killings occurred over several days. This wasn't a panicked massacre in the heat of battle. It was organized, systematic extermination. The chronicles remain silent. The sagas never mention it, but the bones testify to what happened. One final detail makes it unforgettable. Carved into one skull was a runic inscription. 3 words in Old Norse: "Better this way." During that mass execution, someone paused to carve a message into bone, a justification. Even in the middle of slaughter, they needed to believe they were right. The skull belonged to a girl no older than 12 to 14 years. Isotope analysis proves she was born in Norway, brought to England as a child, and killed by her own people to prevent capture. The carving was done after death, as if to explain to her, or to themselves, why it had to happen. The Vikings understood perfectly what they had created, and in the end, they destroyed what they loved most, rather than let it suffer what they had inflicted on countless others.